Welcome to the Happy Disruptors podcast. If you're a creative thinker with an unconventional approach to your industry, you just might be a happy disruptor. Join your friends at the Great Outdoors Foundation for honest conversations about tackling critical issues like conservation with an uncritical disposition. If you like to smile and get things done, this is the podcast for you. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Hannah Inman, CEO of the Great Outdoors Foundation. Thank you for joining us today. And I'm really excited about this panel because I think it's going to address some of the concerns and challenges we have coming up. But before we jump in, I'd like for each of you to just share a little bit about yourself and the work that your organizations are doing related to market diversification. T, we'll start with you.
Great. Well, my name is T. Thomas. I'm CEO of a company called Quantified Ventures. We are based out of DC. We kind of coined the term outcomes-based financing by launching the first environmental impact bond about 12 years ago. And that concept of trying to get what you pay for in nature and connecting ecosystem services to the way markets actually work. It's this like weird space that's between needs for really good important things like regenerative ag and clean water and wetlands and all of that kind of stuff, and people that have money on the other side and trying to create transactions in the middle. So most related to this conversation and most related to the folks in this room, about, 5-6 years ago, we formed a joint venture with the Iowa Soybean Association, where we essentially borrowed money from, I don't know if he's in the room, the Iowa Finance Authority, in order to pay farmers up front to do better annual practices. And then we were able to sell those outcomes to all three levels of government. And we were able to sell, the water outcomes, and then sell the carbon outcomes to corporate buyers that needed to meet their Scope 3 carbon outcomes, and then use that money to then repay the financing. So we did that for a number of years. That launched the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund, or SWAF, that many of us in this room are familiar with. So a little bit in that vein, it's not pure market diversification, but this idea of diversification being lots of ways to try to compensate farmers for the real value of what they do as stewards of our land, and to find ways that actually compensate them to serve in that stewardship. That's kind of one example, and one that's relative to folks in this room. But we've done a lot of regenerative ag transition financing and trying to figure out ways to make the capital patient enough to help the farmer actually make that transition. So we do a lot in ag equipment financing, work with some of the partners in this room on things like irrigation modernization and how do you connect, again, the outcomes that we get on farms by doing better annual structural practices, and then how do you try to find additional ways to compensate for that work. So I'm not sure, that was a pretty long answer, but there you go.
Thanks, Steve. I can't believe that I'm on a stage with the CEO of Quantified Ventures. You're famous. Famous organization as well in pioneering this kind of work of using these financial structures to reward and incentivize better outcomes. So my name is Rex Raymond. I am the director of TIFS, Transformational Investing in Food Systems. We launched about 6 years ago with a specific focus on how to engage the financial sector in the work of financing transitions to more regenerative and, in the global south, agroecological systems. So we do some international work, but work heavily in the US and in the Midwest in particular. As I mentioned, that work is focused on engaging the financial sector. So what does it mean for kind of lenders, private investors, ultimately the larger institutions to engage in appropriate ways, find their pathway, engage in fit-for-purpose finance solutions that support the market development and the demand pool for products that are grown in a more diverse production system. So diversification for us means kind of more diverse landscapes where the kinds of multiple types of value are understood, quantified, recognized, and where the structures exist for the producer, their input providers, their technical assistance providers, their seed breeders, and then the businesses that they work with to buy their products and take them to the market are all working together in order to create multiple options for producers. So I know I was in one of the breakout sessions earlier before the lunch that was really focused on specific kind of practices and incentivizing different conservation practices on the land. And we see the lack of, or the gaps really in market and market pull for producers as one where finance needs to come alongside the producers and the businesses that are creating those businesses and are trying to figure out what's needed next in order to scale those markets and how does finance operate in service of those activities. So that's a little bit about us. I'll share some examples of the kind of work that we've done as we get further into the conversation.
Awesome. Well, I'm happy to be here. And just so you all know, we can't see you, just so you know. But we are very happy to be here, very happy to be looking out at you. But my name is Alan Martinez. I just arrived from New York, where I work at Cornell University. I work at the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability. We are the university's sustainability research hub. There, I focus on climate and nature finance, and I'm really excited about the conversation we're going to have today. I think the one thing that I would put out there just to frame what I do and how I fit into the market diversification question is to say that we've been doing, with many of you and with people on this stage, a lot of great work on how do you pay growers and producers for outcomes. This is a more difficult question, I have to admit. How do you change markets? How do you create markets? How do you support markets? Is a really interesting and important question because we found that even if you could pay farmers, if they don't have a market to sell into, what happens? And so I'm excited to explore that a lot more with the panelists today. For me, I think that the only other thing I would say is, because of my focus on finance, I would really encourage you to think about when we talk about these issues, where is the risk and where is the capital? And are they in the right places? So I'll leave it with the question. Hannah.
We'll have to get into that. The ag sector is facing pressure from every angle. While water quality, public health, and rural communities are suffering from a broken system, why is financing for market diversification such a critical pathway for greater outcomes for all? I'll let you guys, who wants it first?
Go ahead. I'll take a stab,
Yeah,
and then Rex, you can catch whatever I miss, I'm sure, which will be plenty. So it's really hard to be a farmer. I think, just to preach at the choir in the room, I'm a native Iowan. I didn't grow up knowing very many people that weren't either hobby or full-time farmers or work for a farm. It's a big part of, frankly, still who I am, even though I live lots of states away from Southeast Iowa. So I would say, it's really hard to understand who makes the crazy decision to be a farmer these days. Like, their average income for a farmer has been declining year after year, so the actual money that goes to the pocket of a farmer decreases. Meanwhile, all of these other issues, I think someone, maybe Hannah or someone this morning said that, like water quality is like a symptom of a greater broken system. And so I think none of the farmers that I know, like, everyone wants good public health. We know the cancer rates, we know the issues related to health and water and all of that. And I think at the same time, going to Ellen's comment about risk, it's like a lot of the pressure is on the one farmer to really make that decision to, like, change not just, I think I'm gonna, grow blueberries instead of, commodity crops. We're gonna talk about how that risks things like not having crop insurance. And you're not just changing from non-organic to organic. You have to have different infrastructure to transport everything. You have to have different storage, right? You don't just flip a switch and make those changes. What financing, and I use the term patient financing or sculpted financing, can allow our farmers to do is really allow them to have what I think of as this J curve of the ability to take on a new diversified crop, maybe in addition to what they're already doing, but allowing them to take on a new crop, find the markets, invest in the infrastructure needed. It really is about 5 years where the earnings kind of dip down before they start to go all the way up. And then the opportunity for financing to match that adoption curve and help get to building new markets, diversification, and that middle infrastructure. So Rex, I'm curious, I'll just go straight to you on this because I know you do a lot of work really focused on, so maybe that's where I'll baton pass that to you.
That's a great handoff. So let's think about then what happens post Farmgate. It's if the producer doesn't have anywhere to go with their, say they want to add oats to our corn and soy rotation, where do they take those oats? It's taken a while to start to build that infrastructure. So in addition to that possibility of a yield dip, there's also the time it takes to figure out and optimize that additional crop in a rotation. There are some producers who are adding oats who are now also, as a result of that, see they have more opportunities for fodder and feed and reintegrating livestock in their operations. So that's a great story of all that diversification at the level of the farm. But there has to be that partnership with an off-taker that can take the oats into the marketplace where you need maybe you have a nearby packer that can work with you on the livestock, but we're also working with ranchers who would like to see, in addition to the big packing houses and maybe some on-farm butchery and direct-to-consumer, some of that mid-size processing, where as a group of farmers and ranchers, you have some more control over the value addition that happens there and bring some of that value back to the operation. So we see those case examples of what's possible, and it's tremendously encouraging. And we see the benefits that come with that, the co-benefits for water quality, for biodiversity, for carbon, but also for bringing meaningful jobs back to the community in these middle of the supply chain operations. But the financial sector has to be brought along as well. Are they ready to come in and participate in some pretty complex structures? If we're talking about a mid-sized mill, oat mill, let alone talk about a mid-sized livestock processing plant, there is a lot of complexity in that, and those operations are often not very well understood by mainstream finance. So I think that's we're starting to look at how do you engage different actors in the financial sector that need to be part of some of these more complex transactions to make sure that they pencil out for everybody. So that they become success stories and are there to stay in the community and to drive and enable some of these on-farm transitions.
No, I appreciate that. I think that, why do we do this? Why would we want to do market? As I just said, it's one of the hardest things to do. Why do we do it? Well, if you take a look at the farming economy, I think you'll get a pretty quick answer. And the one great thing about working in agriculture research is we have hundreds, now more than 100 years of data to look back on. And if you look at some of the diversification and research studies, it's clear that diversification does provide a boost in financial profitability for farmers. And that's really the only thing farmers want to hear about today, is how can I be more profitable in this volatile environment? So at a minimum, for economic stability in our rural communities, this is one of the reasons to create market diversification. I think it's important that we go back to Rex's and T's comments about, well, what does that mean? What is that infrastructure? But at a minimum, what we're seeing is if we want a more resilient rural economy, we need to have more diversification there.
So that sort of leads into our next question is, what are those infrastructure gaps? But I think something that you said, Rex, which is fascinating, is we need that mid-size, mill, processor, all of that, which is completely contradictory to what we've seen in the ag industry the last 5 to 10 years or longer. So what does that look like? How does that work? And how do you find that matching finance to make that work?
It's hard, right? It's a piece of infrastructure or part of the infrastructure that has disappeared from many of our landscapes, and it's kind of has to be rebuilt. It's sort of too big to do alone, but smaller than the larger consolidated kind of business supply chains. And so it takes collaboration, right? It often takes kind of multiple producers working together to create the scale of supply. It requires some participation and collaboration with off-takers who are willing to be patient and work with those producers on, say, a food-grade oat kind of supply chain for the U.S. market, right? So it doesn't get commingled with in an international commodity supply chain where you have to truck your oats to Canada, and then timing is critical. So maybe for a while, as farmers are adding these new crops to their rotation, they may have to ship it pretty far, or it may just get commingled with other products. But once the scale is there, and once the off-takers are there, then the opportunity starts to emerge for building that mid-size infrastructure. And it's hard work, and it's maybe a little bit counter to, well, actually I've heard a lot about collaboration at this conference. So I know that there is a lot of collaboration that is happening, but it's maybe also collaboration across some odd bedfellows. So some weird investors who see the importance of these operations and the potential for new markets and are willing to take a risk. But often those deals also require collaboration between some organizations that can provide some loans, others that can offer some patient capital to absorb some of the risk, but also some that are investing in the operation and actually take a stake in the operation by buying shares, for instance. So that's all. Yeah, it takes all those pieces coming together, and it's a long process.
Yeah.
Can I add, Hannah?
Yeah, please do.
For me, so I have a colleague at Cornell, Becca Jablonski, an economist in the Dyson School, and she put her finger on something that you really said, the commingling piece. Mm-hmm. What we have today is a system of commodities that, and no matter how great a regenerative farmer you are in corn, once it's out of the farm gate, it's gone. That attribute, that feature is gone because there's not a market. And if there's not a market, that's another reason, the earlier question, why should we finance market diversification? Because you get all of these great farmers, leading farmers, early adopters, they do all of this work to create regenerative corn, and then it's gone. The feature, the attribute, the quality, if it's not sold locally or if it doesn't go immediately into a supply chain, it becomes just another commodity. And so for me, I think that is what Professor Jablonski has really pointed at, is this is where we in trying to change this system, this is one really important place to spend our time of how do we get the buyers to think about the segregation of regenerative corn or whatever commodity or whatever label we want to use. That if you can't do that, you can't sell into a market if you can't label it or feature it. And so that part of that the infrastructure, it's not so much we need another plant or we just need buyers to start thinking about, do we want to demand that feature, that attribute from the growers?
So similar to how we did with organics, right?
Yes, which is exactly one of the reasons I said at the beginning, this is really hard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we touched on it a little bit about the role of risk, right? We've sort of danced around it. But what role does risk play in market diversification, and how can financing tools help reduce that risk during periods of transition?
I'm happy to jump in. So we look at risk at multiple levels. So you have the risk at the systems levels where, for instance, crop insurance can really be a helpful tool. And our current set of crop insurance tools are a little bit limited. So, but there's some innovations that are coming down the pike. There is currently a first cohort that is onboarding in one of the Midwest states for a soil health-based crop insurance product. So the insurance company is actually providing discounts to farmers that are using practices. No matter what crops you're growing, they're providing discounts based on the practices that they are using that are correlated to the health of your soils. And that then is translated into these risk models that can price the risk of a farmer that is improving their soils versus a farmer that is using practices that are depleting the nutrients in their soils. I think that's something that hasn't really been in the market before, but is one of those kind of systemic tools that finance can offer. But then it happens at every level, right? That risk management, the farmers are managing their risk on the farm about what crops they're planting, kind of managing all their input-related risk and market-related risk as much as possible. But then in these systems, in a diversified system, theoretically, you would also be building a more resilient operation, especially if these relationships can exist between the processor, aggregator, and your off-takers. And there we have to look at down to the level of contract terms. How are those relationships expressed in contracts so that everyone kind of takes a little bit of that risk and de-risk the producer whose behavior mostly we're always asking to change, but everybody plays a role in doing so.
Maybe I'll just give an example of maybe what you're talking about in terms of the spreading out the risk.
Yeah.
So there was a fund. So my past life was working in the government water money space before joining QV. So again, different hat, different seat of the house, but in the state of Vermont, a few years ago, we had a bunch of dairy farms. Dairy farms are not doing so well these days. So there are something like 500 dairies out of business right now, and that number just continues to grow. And that's in Vermont, which is no one lives there. It's just me and 4 other people.
That are at this conference.
Yeah, they're all here. We all came together. So we created this program with a local NGO called the Farmland Futures Fund. Again, because it was money I could be creative in how it was deployed. We essentially, the local NGO would do the hands-on technical assistance. We would have a bunch of farmers that would say, yes, we want to transition to some other diversified set, but we don't know where to start. The money seems hard. We're already leveraged up to our eyeballs in debt. We can't do anymore. And so we said, okay, what tools do we have in the toolbox from a financing perspective, and what can sort of government do to play a role in supporting that ag transition along with that NGO partner? And this fund that we created allowed for 0% 5-year deferred repayment to allow the farmer, there was money and technical assistance for that NGO to help the farmers during that transition period. And then the state also sort of related but unrelated needed water quality improvements to meet their goals with their own requirements for EPA. And so the state basically said, hey, you know, this regenerative transition, it actually kind of also meets some of our water quality goals. And then the state was able to participate as a sort of early buyer to help sort of ease that transition with a different revenue stream while the farmer was learning their way into a new market. So one thing I have learned is that Iowa farming and Vermont farming have nothing to do with one another, but that similar problem of how do we transition, what's the role of government to step in and say, here's how we can be creative. We have our corporate partners that I know are in the room right now. What role can they play? And then I think, of course, we have a lot of really great NGO partners on the ground that can help on that technical assistance side. But ultimately, to Rex's point, if we really want this to happen, it cannot all be just on the farmer and asking them to chip in. And the other thing that I would say, and Alan, I'm curious, we didn't practice this in advance, so I'm going to throw you like a question that's not here. Yeah, I love doing this to Alan. It's my favorite thing.
Ready.
I know, I think Vincent is in the room from Environmental Defense Fund. So I know there's been a lot of kind of academic smart people thinking about kind of return on investment for some of these regenerative practices. So I'm just curious, as you're thinking of diversification, market transition, how much you and your partners in Extension are trying to think about communicating ROI on cover crops and improve, I don't know, is this a softball or you're like, don't know what I'm talking about?
I love it.
Okay.
I love it.
Right.
It's not a softball.
Alan's like, I'm never coming back.
I'm never want to come back to Iowa
Jeez,
again.
Really? No, it's a great question, and I think that the question is around risk, right? So I think that for us, there is risk all over this, and the farmers are taking on the bulk of it.
Yep.
We are asking them to change practices without markets. We're asking them to change practices without payments or payments not upfront. We're asking them to change practices not knowing if there will be a yield impact.
Yeah.
So we're asking them to do a lot. And yes, there has been a great deal of research, but I think the results really bear out where there is progress and where there's not. Great work is being done on the farm credit side to innovate in this space and to bring new products, not because, definitely a mission-driven organization, but not because of the mission, but because I think they're starting to see that, oh yes, there is a positive ROI or positive credit risk quality impact of this particular practice. Introduce a digester into a dairy. Yeah, that's good for the dairy, it's good economics, it will lend. But there are some things that we as conservation or sustainability professionals might be asking farmers to do where there isn't proof yet. And there you cannot expect a financial system or a financial sector to lend or to invest. That does give us a great opportunity to bring in philanthropy and a great opportunity to bring in government to help us prove some of these things that aren't quite proven. And so I thank you for giving the shout out to one of the smartest guys I know, Vincent, and the team at FAR. EDF and FAR are partnering with us to do some research that we'll talk about tomorrow on where are we seeing progress and what's the next frontier of research that still needs to be solved in order for us to continue to get some momentum in the conservation agriculture space.
That question was just to get you guys to come to Alan's session
yes,
tomorrow.
Exactly.
And the next one.
And the
here.
next one. So there's a lot of just plugging for the
next
section.
one, Vincent will be on stage, and it's going to be talking about the role of philanthropy, the role of finance, and the role of markets.
Yeah.
You got the setup.
Thank you,
Good.
guys. Thank you for doing that. We didn't practice it. So we've talked about two really great examples, but I'm just wondering if you guys have other examples, because scaling is such a challenge that finance solutions can address. What does that look like in practice? What are some other great examples?
I think Alan has already said it, right? Scaling and I think this cuts into our next question as well. It's like the different roles of different types of finance providers: philanthropy, government, private sector, and in the private sector, there's a whole range of different capital providers. Kind of traditional ag lenders. You have all kinds of interesting impact finance initiatives, but kind of scaling really happens with private capital. And kind of private sector partnerships and with government. And it's really kind of philanthropy, and so the innovation grants from government can kind of show the viability, including economic viability of a model. And then if the markets are there and the markets can respond, that will attract private capital. But the structures have to be there for scaling, right? It's especially in the sector that we're talking about, ag, land stewardship, for work to really hold the integrity, where everybody benefits, and we really look at all the outcomes from farmer livelihoods to kind of worker, kind of dignified work, to health outcomes, to all the environmental outcomes, that will require so high integrity. Nice.
Alan disagrees.
Can you mute my mic, please? Please continue.
And I think those are some of those scaling structures that I think this community is also building, right? There's so much great experience with specific experiments, really, and even I think Quantified Ventures, starting a decade ago, now is demonstrating the viability of these outcome-based approaches. I think it lays the groundwork for scaling. And kind of we like to think we use this kind of market maturity curve just to help our own thinking of what kinds of capital plays at what stages of maturity in an ag production system, whether that's livestock or cattle for beef or dairy or kind of commodity row crops. All these parts of the system are at different stages of maturity at different times, and it's really about figuring out what those structures are that allow capital to come in alongside that change process at scale.
We've done some recent research, and I apologize, I didn't get the briefing on the mic situation. We've done some recent case study work on the sustainability-linked loan that CoBank launched last year, and which Hannah, you know very well. And I think it signals that, again, that there is some maturity happening in this space. And that there is this potential for scaling or testing of what can scale and what cannot scale. I know that internationally, and you mentioned earlier off-taker agreements, there have been organizations that have been able to bundle off-taker agreements and thereby create the market. One of the biggest challenges that we face, especially in the United States, is that some of those anchor institutional partners that we need to create a market, that would be government, that would be schools, that would be a lot of these organizations that buy food. They pay really, really slowly, 90 days, 120 days. And that kind of delay in payment can really bankrupt small farms. And so that is one of the spaces where I think there's innovation happening. I know that the Rockefeller Foundation, for example, has been doing a lot of good work on farm to school, creating markets for farm to school programs. And so we're seeing it. We're seeing it at scale, sometimes at national levels, Hannah, but also at local levels. But we're in this experimentation stage that I think is important, and I think signals, again, why this topic was and is so relevant.
I'll just tag on to the end of that. I think also when we're thinking about what are the examples where this works, what are ways, there are some really great case studies out there that like we would all put on our LinkedIn and we're like, look at this great big thing that we did. The reality is, as someone who likes to talk about lots of really cool big things, sometimes you can support market transition with like sort of less sexy ways. So there are, so one of our clients is the Montgomery County Green Bank, LAUDA, and their resilience fund, and like a lot of the work that they are doing, and this is in the state of Maryland in Montgomery County, 1 million people, what they are doing in order to support some of their local like fruit and veg farmers, again, not necessarily the same as our commodity row crop ag, but one of the like localized sort of policy decisions that they've made is like all their food banks, like that's a contract with their local farmers. And so there's like an aggregation of local farmers to be able to provide that food, but it has created this consistent subsidy where those food banks are paying a premium price locally. It's probably a little more expensive than buying through other sort of distribution channels, but that kind of policy and contracting decision at the local level has created or like reinforced a market that we didn't have to buy new grain bins and new trucks to haul. Like it's a hyper local opportunity. And so I would just encourage, like sometimes the problems seem so big that we think about some of these micro decisions that can be made, and I would say like there are a lot more of those opportunities out there.
That's a great point, T. I think
Thank you.
Food hubs are yes, always a great point from T. But I think we're seeing this. We're seeing food hubs all over the country. They do the aggregation and then they give payments on terms, and so I think that are more beneficial to those farmers. We may not see it. There might not be a big press release about what is happening out there, but people are pushing and trying to find these opportunities. If you hear of them and if you're doing them, come talk to me. We definitely want to research those and share those with the world and people who are doing this work.
Yep.
So we've touched on this a little bit, but we're talking about the roles and what roles should government, philanthropy, and private capital play in supporting diversified ag systems. And I would encourage you to add just on top of that, what are those enabling conditions, right? You know, in the two examples that you gave, T, it was government being really innovative or thinking outside of the box of what their normal programs are for. So can you guys expand on not only the roles of those three, but also what are some of the enabling conditions that allow for scale and diversification? I know that one was off. That was off script.
No, I'll give you the latter. I think for me, government should be doing things that nobody else wants to do or that aren't really proven. Philanthropy should join them in that. I'm at a research university. Nobody makes money off of research, so we need to figure out how do we fund good research. That's a great role for government and philanthropic dollars. That said, as you start moving towards market diversification, nothing's going to happen if we're just researching markets. What's going to happen if you start taking risks? And so those early first loss philanthropic dollars are really, really valuable, really important. I'd say the only thing that if you asked me what should we only do, it would be investing in this missing middle. That's the real bottleneck in all of the work that we're doing, investing there. And that does take to, I know it's a popular term now, blended capital, but we do need that mix of people who understand what rigor are we going to need in the longer term for successful business operations, but also what risk are we willing to take early on. And they're not the same. You can't ask a venture capitalist to do a debt loan. You can't ask a banker to do a venture loan, agreement. So I think that, and you can't ask philanthropy everybody has their lane and they have really important funding and funding constraints that we need to think about and figure out how to work together on those.
I think that's a great point. I think that's often, the world of finance is often so hard to understand and dissect for an outsider, or somebody who's not working in finance. And yeah, it's, if you're, and this is, I admire farmers and farmer entrepreneurs who are trying to build something new and are kind of on their own trying to put that capital stack, sometimes call it, or blended capital, putting that together in a way that works for their operation, because it means endless knocking on doors and getting answers like, it's not quite the right fit for me for these reasons. But often they don't even hear the reasons. And so I think this is one of the reasons why we prototyped, and then our partner organization is managing something called Diversifund. And it was structured as a toolbox for investors and entrepreneurs and farmers to use to make it easier to put some different types of loans, some de-risking mechanism, some equity investment together in a package that makes sense for the particular business and what their financing needs are. So I think there is that process of putting the different types of capital together, especially in this middle of the supply chain, this missing middle, that does require a lot of this cooperation and blending of capital. And then I also love to think about catalytic capital, so philanthropy and government. They can do things like a state government is currently funding the initial feasibility study of this crop insurance product that I mentioned. Perfect role for them, right? It's like demonstrate that this is viable, that it creates a benefit for their constituents, the farmers in this Midwest state, and then let the private sector to kind of take off with it. Philanthropy can still play a role in maintaining an option, for instance, by purchasing some of the data sets that are publicly governed or communally governed that maintain a pathway for farmers to create their own risk pools in this case, right? So that it doesn't all have to be just certain large corporations driving a particular solutions. There are roles for the government and philanthropy to also then keep alternative and parallel pathways open. It's a little hard to, this question is hard to answer in the abstract. Each situation is different, but I think it's for all of us to think about where do all these different sources of capital play a role in creating a really resilient system, and that is, the whole conversation about diversification, it really is about resilience and intentionally creating the multiple kinds of outcomes that a resilient food and ag system can create.
Well, I think I'll just give another example. I feel that I express myself best through interpretive dance or a story. And since we're professional, I will stick with a story. So, I think if y'all are from Iowa, you're somewhat familiar with SWAF, Soil and Water Outcomes Fund. To me, it's not right. We want it to do structural practices. Maybe there are opportunities to do different things, but it by itself is a phenomenal example of all of those different sectors and how each one of them, if we're doing the autopsy on how did it come to be. So way back in the beginning, working with the Soybean Association and their willingness to invest in water quality, in order to design SWAF, secure the funding, we needed philanthropy to help us design that and figure out what were the agronomists going to do and where did the outcomes, what were the calculations we were going to use. That was philanthropy that was supporting that early feasibility design. Once it became a thing and we had secured water and carbon, the state of Iowa, the Iowa Finance Authority, through the State Revolving Fund, took on, in hindsight, a risky loan in order to invest in this upfront payment, right? So there's philanthropy, doing feasibility of something that sounds like maybe a good idea and we hope it will happen. We have the state coming in and taking on the risk of this loan for additional diversified revenue for these farmers. And then, of course, we have the corporate buyers and then the federal government on the back end. And it was a private entity, our company, playing that sort of cat herder financing role in the middle in partnership with with a nonprofit, which was the Soybean Association. So I don't say that to just be that's the one deal that identifies it, but I think generally in those terms of, government taking that step forward where the risk and the investment needs to be sizable, philanthropy playing that catalytic role to help catalyze it, just in size of philanthropy investing in our space. Philanthropy is never going to replace the federal or state government. Like, it's just not going to happen. So they, like the rest of us in this room, are looking for ways that they can catalyze other dollars, and like that's really where it's a great role for philanthropy, in my opinion. And then I think like having sort of that private sector to like help, whether that's private nonprofit or private for-profit, but that engine to kind of cat herd and make those dollars run through. I feel like there's some illustration there.
Okay, so we have 4 minutes left. So this is going to be your guys' last statement.
That's great.
If we want these alternative markets to scale meaningfully, what needs to happen next?
Alan?
I already said, number one, we need to fund the missing middle. We need to invest in that infrastructure. And that doesn't mean we have to build a bunch of plants and create a bunch of railroads to get things to market. It just means figuring out who to talk to, who to influence, to bring people together. I think that's one of the really important things. Another really important thing that is happening is these products these financial products that are emerging, that are starting to more and more put the farmer first. And I think the SWAF is a great example of it. But there are others, and we're seeing that innovation happening. We have to get the demand to anchor. We need to get those. We can't be just name your favorite brand, right? It can't just be one company that says, we're going to create this market, because then we end up where we are today with a lot of concentration risk. And so trying to get the buyers together, I think, is really important. I'll say this last thing, since it's my last comment, is we built this system. This is the system we have today, and we built it brick by brick, crop insurance subsidy by, commodity and the railroads and all this. We built this, and we would be really smart to use those tools to build the system we want. If we want market diversification, that means we need to go back to some of these same tools and figure out how do we orient them to the system that we see as needed. I'll end there.
I love that. I think
Mic drop.
Yeah, that's awesome.
What Alan said.
So 3 things for me. We think about, for diversified and alternative markets to work, we think about the physical infrastructure that's needed, the data infrastructure, and the financial infrastructure. And we talked about all those pieces. I think the data piece a little bit less than some of the other things, but what do we need in order to price externalities, to really understand the evidence and be able to predict the outcomes for a producer or a business once they go through this diversification process. So all 3 are needed, and all that is enabled by people actually working together. Producers in a region, working together with businesses, working together with finance providers to create financing solutions that are fit for purpose.
Okay, well, I'll +1 everything these guys said. And then I'll just add on one other, like if I were in charge of the world kind of thing, which I'm not yet, which is we spend a lot of time being like, we need more money, which is always true. I also live with this really healthy hypothesis that we have a bunch of money that's very disconnected and not necessarily being deployed in the most efficient way. So we can all academically be like, farmers help with all of these benefits when they do good regenerative practice or reduced application of whatever. We know that the number of outcomes are many, and almost every outcome probably has a chunk of money associated with it somewhere. So I think to the degree that we can think about aggregating different sources of money, and we kind of talked about this in some of the earlier sessions, so things like government money for ag money, which isn't the same bucket as flood money, which isn't the same as stormwater money, because did you guys know that stormwater and floodwater are different? Well, They are. So, like to the degree that we can start to align bigger, more impactful projects and pots of money to help ease some of that transition and draw those connections to the outcomes that we want and start to align some of the money that we exist, like, I think that would be helpful to some of the other infrastructure needs that we have.
Great, and you only went 30 seconds over.
Great.
Thank you guys for all being here, and if you want to know about the role of philanthropy, finance, and private capital, that's the next session. So thank you for being here.
Great.
Awesome.